In this lesson, we will examine the concept of independent events. To do this, we will examine two questions. The first is one you saw earlier, and the second question is almost identical to the first question. In both questions, we are selecting two balls, and in both questions, we want to find the probability that both selected balls are green. The only difference between these two questions is that in the first question, we are selecting the balls without replacement. This means that once the first ball is selected, it remains out of the box for the second selection. In the second question, we are selecting the balls with replacement. So after the first ball is selected, it is put back into the box before the second selection. For both questions, we'll say that event A is selecting a green ball on the first draw, and event B is selecting a green ball on the second draw. For both of these questions, we want to find the probability that event B occurs. In other words, the probability that the second ball selected is green. Let's begin with the top question. If two balls are drawn without replacement, what is the probability that the second ball will be green? Well, this is a difficult question to answer, since it depends on the ball that was selected first. For example, if the first ball selected is green, then we are left with 6 balls and 3 of them are green. So the probability is 3/6 that the second ball will be green. But we don't know that the first ball selected will be green. What if the first ball selected is red? If that is the case, then we are left with 6 balls and 4 of them are green. So the probability is 4/6 that the second ball will be green. So the probability that the second ball is green can be either 3/6 or 4/6. The probability depends on whether or not event A occurs. Since the probability of event B depends on whether event A occurs, we say that events A and B are dependent. Now let's examine the second question. For this question, what is the probability that the second ball selected will be green? Well, here we don't need to know whether or not event A occurs. Once a ball is selected on the first draw, it is replaced before the second ball is drawn. This means that for the second draw, we will have 7 balls and 4 of them will be green. So the probability that the second ball selected will be green is equal to 4/7. Since the probability of event B does not depend on whether or not event A occurs, we say that events A and B are independent. The important feature about dependent and independent events is that they affect the formula related to the probability of two events both occurring. If two events are dependent, then the probability that events A and B both occur is as follows. And if two events are independent, then the probability that events A and B both occur is shown here. Now let's apply our knowledge of dependent and independent events. In this question, we are selecting one number from the first set and one number from the second set. We want to find the probability that both selected numbers are odd. For this question, we'll say that event A is selecting an odd number from the first set, and event B is selecting an odd number from the second set. To find the probability that events A and B both occur, we should first determine whether these two events are dependent or independent. To do this, we'll ask the question, does the occurrence of one event affect the probability of the other event? Well, event A is selecting an odd number from the first set. If that event occurs, and we do select an odd number, does this affect the probability of event B, which is selecting an odd number from the second set? The answer here is no. Whether or not we select an odd number from the first set has no effect on the probability of selecting an odd number from the second set. As such, we can say that events A and B are independent, which means we will use this formula to determine the probability that events A and B both occur. Okay, now let's answer the question. First, we need to find the probability of event A. Event A is selecting an odd number from the first set. Since only one of the 4 numbers in the first set is odd, the probability of event A is 1/4. Now on to the probability of event B, selecting an odd number from the second set. Well, the second set has 5 numbers, and 3 of them are odd. So the probability of event B is 3/5. At this point, we can multiply the two probabilities to get 3/20. So the probability is 3/20 that both selected numbers will be odd. Please note that although many students prefer the formula for independent events over the formula for dependent events, the formula for dependent events will work for all probabilities involving the word and. Conversely, the formula for independent events only works for probabilities where the events are independent. Now let's see how the formula for dependent events works on this question, even though the two events involved are independent. Here we'll begin with the probability of event A. Since one of the 4 numbers in the first set is odd, the probability of event A is 1/4. Now we need to find the probability of event B given that event A has occurred. In other words, we want to find the probability that the number selected from the second set is odd given that the number selected from the first set is odd. Now we already saw that the outcome from selecting a number from the first set has no effect on selecting a number from the second set. Nevertheless, if we assume that the number selected from the first set is odd, we can see that the second set has 5 numbers and 3 of them are odd. So the probability of event B, given that event A has occurred, is equal to 3/5. At this point, we can multiply the two probabilities to get 3/20. So even though events A and B are independent, the formula for dependent events still works. Now in this lesson, we examined the differences between dependent and independent events, and we saw that there are 2 formulas for the probability of events A and B both occurring. We also learned that the formula for dependent events will work for questions where the events are either dependent or independent.